Hello Flight Simmers and welcome to Alpha Hotel Flight Simulator Training. This is going to be lesson number 1 of our VFR or private pilot level flight training. In today's lesson we'll do a normal takeoff and then we'll talk about the 4 basics of flight: straight and level, turns, climbs, and descents. Before we hop in the airplane and go flying though, let's talk about how to set up the simulator for our first flight. Alright, so we're at the welcome screen for Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020, and this video assumes that you've already set up your Flight Simulator options for flight training. If not, take a look at the channel overview and Flight Simulator setup. That does a deep dive into the options and how you want to configure them for flight training. Today we're just going to get in and set up that first flight. So we'll go to World Map and we'll work our way from left to right. First, you want to make sure you have the right aircraft selected, so you click on the airplane picture to go there. Aircraft selection is usually where it ends up first. And we want the Textron Aviation Cessna 152. We do not want the Aerobat. So that's what aircraft selection does. Liveries is just what color scheme you have on your airplane. The left two here are the defaults in Flight Simulator. You can download livery packs. There's a mod out there that has a large livery pack for a bunch of different airplanes, including a lot of real-world liveries for airliners, if you're interested in getting that. Weight and balance, we do want to make some adjustments here. It defaults to 50% on the fuel, so we do want to move that to 100% in each tank, left and right main. So you'll have a full tank, 2 full tanks of gas. And then it defaults to pilot and front passengers, both weighing 170 pounds. Sure, we'll go with that. That's probably what I weighed the last time I was in a 152. And you can see it gives you your empty weight of the airplane. It gives you how much more fuel you could put on if you had capacity to do it. You don't. It gives you what your payload currently is and what your max payload is. And then it tells you what your current weight is and what the max gross weight of the airplane is. So we could squeeze a few more pounds on there if we wanted to, but we're fairly close, within 100 pounds of max gross weight, which is fine for training. It also displays over here where your center of gravity is, and the 2 white lines there are the limits of the center of gravity, so it's inside the envelope, and that's a good thing. Failures we're not going to use until we get into more advanced training, but you can see there are a few failures that you can induce on yourself if you want to. And let's go ahead and talk about ATC options. So for the ATC options, the first option up here is tail number. That is what will be displayed on your aircraft as your registration number. On the 152, it's on the tail and under the wing. And it is also, if you don't put in a call sign and a flight number, it is what air traffic control will call you. In the United States, all registration numbers start with N. And ATC will call you either November and then your registration number, or they will call you by your make and model. So they will call you Cessna, in this case 152 Alpha Hotel. Flight Simulator is not able to do that. If you put an N on there like you would want to see on your airplane, it's also it's gonna call you Cessna November 152 Alpha Hotel. So it's just a little oddity of Flight Simulator. If you want to have a call sign instead of being called by your registration number when you're dealing with ATC, you can enter that in here. In order for these to work, you have to enter both a call sign and a flight number. If you leave either of those blank, it's going to default back to just calling you by your registration number. With the call sign, you can put up pretty much anything you want in here, and the Microsoft AI speech will try to say whatever you put in there. You can put in multiple words. If you do that, you should put hashes or dashes in between them so that it doesn't run the words all together. And then you do have to put a flight number in there for that to work as well. Again, it'll try to say just about anything with limited exceptions. So if you want to be super awesome pilot, number 1, you can totally have air traffic control call you super awesome pilot number 1. So again, with limited exceptions, it'll try to put anything you want in there. You can also be a heavy if you want. All you have to do is click and you will be super awesome pilot number 1 heavy if you'd like to do that. So, but again, we're not going to be using the radios in in the flight training, so I just go with the registration number and have it painted on the side of the aircraft. All right, next we need to select our departure airport. We will not need to select an arrival airport. We'll just be doing local training for the first couple of lessons. So go ahead and click on Select Departure Airport. And the airport I've selected is Kilo Papa Bravo Foxtrot. So enter that in there. That'll bring up the results. And we see KPBF, Pine Bluff Regional Airport, Grider Field in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. And then go down to the runway tab and select runway 18 is the runway we'll be using. I've selected Pine Bluff for a number of reasons. First of all, it has a single runway so that when we're doing traffic pattern work, we can't get confused and accidentally try to aim for the wrong runway in our traffic patterns. If there's only one runway, it's easy to find the correct runway. The second is because the runway is oriented pretty much due north and south, so when we're doing our pattern work, we can do all of our traffic pattern legs turning in cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. The length and width of the runway is just shy of 6,000 feet long, and it's 150 feet wide. That's a good sized runway for doing training. It's at an elevation of 205 feet, which is very near sea level, which is good for aircraft performance, and it also gives us a lot of room to climb up and do maneuvers. Finally, the terrain around the airport is all flat farmland terrain if you're using the satellite images. This is good for two reasons. First of all, it's good for orientation because property lines on farm property typically run north, south, east, and west. So if you've lined up with one of those lines, you're pretty much lined up in a cardinal direction. And it also provides lots of options for when we start doing engine failures and off-airport landings. It's nice to have a lot of open fields nearby to choose from. So that's the reason that we'll be using Pine Bluff. Next, we'll move on to flight conditions. All right, so flight conditions is where you set your time of day and where you set your weather for the flight. So working our way over from the left here, we want multiplayer off for training. Unless you want to do group training, that's not really a good idea. I do recommend turning air traffic off, so again, we don't have to compete with other airplanes while we're doing our practicing. And then I recommend setting the weather to custom, and we'll go over here and set that up. I like to use the clear sky theme for initial training, give you good visibility and don't have to worry about avoiding clouds. I set the time of day to about noon. That puts the sun directly above your head, and it's a little easier to see the instruments with the sun not coming into the cockpit in funny angles, which is kind of nice. I set the day to about mid-June, nice summer's day, and that also provides you with a good bright sunlight. And then the only thing else you want to change here is the temperature. Instead of 15 degrees Celsius, that's ISA, International Standard Atmosphere, but that's a little chilly. That's about 59 degrees. So I ramp that up to about 25 degrees, which is about 77 degrees. That's more like a June day in Arkansas. So, and then pressure 1013, that's your standard pressure. That's good. That's 2992 on your altimeter, so you don't have to worry about adjusting that. And then with the wind layer, I go ahead. It's only 2 knots that they have in here by default, but it is a crosswind, and really we don't want to deal with that yet. So I go ahead and just delete the wind layer, and that's going to have us set up with calm winds. Once you do that, go back to close, and we are ready to go flying.
Okay, so I lied. There's one more thing that we have to set up before we can go flying, and that's to set up some custom camera views. The way we do this is Alt and then a number. We're going to set up two views, or at least there's 2 views that I recommend setting up. The first is to translate just a little bit right when you get in the cockpit, probably right about there, and then move your seat down just a little bit, and then pan down so that your camera is cut off just below the instrument panel. And if you press Alt 1, that will store that as view number 1, custom camera number 1. And this is a good position for flying. This is a good position for doing your takeoffs, for doing your landings, and for doing maneuvers. And if you pan away, all you have to do is hit Shift 1, and it will move you back to that position. The other position I recommend doing is a little bit lower, slightly lower so that your cutoff is just below where the primer and the master and the ignition is, so that you can see your trim position and your engine controls and your flaps. That's what I would set up as custom camera number 2, and that's just so that you can see mainly your trim indicator, your carb heat, your throttle, your mixture, and your flaps, to see where all those controls are and see how you have the aircraft configured if you're not certain. So that would be cameras 1 and 2. Again, 1's good for flying, 2 is good for making sure you can still fly in 2, but it's good for making sure that your aircraft the controls are where you want them to be. And again, I recommend taking off the yoke visibility just so you can see all your controls. I'll keep it on when we're flying just so you can see what I'm doing with controls, but I recommend turning it off. Okay, so let's step through a normal takeoff. Okay, so we'll do a brief overview of the takeoff procedure, and then we'll step through each step and talk about more details and techniques about each individual step. Before we get going, I'll mention that we are going to do the takeoffs at flaps 10. The 152 can do takeoffs at flaps 10 or flaps 0. Either one works just fine, but they do recommend flaps 10 for short and soft field takeoffs. So to keep things consistent between the takeoffs, we'll just do flaps 10 for a normal takeoff, which is perfectly acceptable. And the takeoff procedure, before you initiate the takeoff, you want to make sure that your before takeoff checklist is complete. Make sure your brakes have been released, both the parking brake and your tow brakes. Make sure you're not holding on to those tow brakes. Then apply takeoff power, which is full power on the 152. As you start rolling down the runway, that's your takeoff roll. You're going to maintain your runway center line with your rudder pedals or whatever you have assigned to the rudder control or the nose wheel steering control. Whatever you have assigned to your aircraft yaw axis will be what you use to keep it in the center. At 50 knots, you want to smoothly rotate the nose to a climb attitude, which is about 10 degrees pitch up on the 152. As you get airborne, you're going to maintain that climb pitch attitude, and your airplane is going to accelerate. And as you get through 60 knots, you're going to go ahead and retract the flaps to flap 0. As you're climbing out, you want to pitch for about 70 knots, so use your pitch to control your speed. Lower is faster, and nose higher up will make you go slower. And once you've set that pitch and you're maintaining 70 knots, then use your elevator trim to maintain that pitch. You want to trim so that you don't have to be constantly pulling on the yoke or pulling on the stick to get the airplane to be where you want it to be. Once you get that trim set, it should pretty much stay where you put it. Once you get to 1,000 feet above the ground, which is about 1,200 feet in Pine Bluff, you can go ahead and turn off your taxi and landing lights and accomplish your after takeoff checklist. All right, so let's break it down a little more detailed in each individual step and talk about some techniques for having a good takeoff. Okay, for the before takeoff checklist, we are not going to use the checklist that's in Flight Simulator. That checklist was taken out of the 152 manual, but the before takeoff checklist for the 152 is actually a run-up checklist. So that's why it has you set the brake at the beginning and then release it in the middle. They've just taken the run-up part out in Flight Simulator. So we're just going to go in a flow pattern here from left to right and then a little jog up to make sure that everything's set the way we want it set for the aircraft to fly. And a flow pattern is a good thing to get into. When you get into bigger airplanes, we use flow patterns a lot for doing an after takeoff procedure or any sort of before landing procedure, that sort of thing, to set everything where we want it. And then we use the checklist to actually go through and make sure everything is where it should be. So basically the flow is your do and the checklist is your done to make sure it got done. And the way we're going to modify this checklist is we're going to make sure the parking brake is released. Not going to get very far if that is still on. Make sure that your lights are on. Basically, you want all the switches down here, including the pitot heat, on except for the dome light. And you can turn the dome light on if you want, but it's not necessary. 3 is the elevator trim. We want to make sure that the elevator trim indicator is at takeoff. When you drop into Flight Simulator, when it drops you on the runway for a takeoff, it will have you configured for takeoff. And they do have it slightly below the takeoff band, and that seems to work out just fine. So just position slightly below takeoff seems to be a good takeoff position for the elevator trim. You want to make sure that your carb heat is off. If you have that on, you're not going to be developing full power. You want to make sure your mixture is full rich. especially if you're below 3,000 feet. And again, if you've got the auto lean, this is not such a big deal. It will already have you automatically leaned for full power, but the appropriate technique is to have it full rich for any takeoff below 3,000 feet. You want the flaps set to 10 degrees, and then you want the transponder set to ALT, or altitude reporting. Again, that's kind of a real-world technique. It's not as big of a deal in Flight Simulator unless you're actually going to be using the air traffic control services in Flight Simulator. If you don't have that on or alt, they are not going to be able to see you. But just for realism, we'll say put that to alt. And once that checklist is done, you're ready to go flying. All right, once your before takeoff check is complete, you'll want to release your parking brakes and make sure you're not toggling the toe brakes. And then you'll want to apply takeoff power, which in the Cessna 152 is fairly straightforward. It's just full throttle or full power. You just move the throttle all the way forward. If you want to be realistic about it like you would in a real airplane, you want to take about a 3 count to move it forward all the way. If you do it faster than in the real airplane, it has a tendency to put too much fuel into the engine, and that can actually choke off the combustion and cause it to stall out, which is not a good thing. But if you don't really care that much, you can do whatever you want. You're not going to hurt the airplane or cause any adverse effects in Flight Simulator. You want to take a look at your RPM gauge once you've got full throttle in there to make sure it's producing full power. In Flight Simulator, if you're static, if you're not moving, you have the brakes applied when you bring the engine up, it's going to go to about 2,300 RPM. As you roll down the runway and get some air going through your propeller, that's going to increase to about 2,400 RPM. And once you level off at cruise, that'll increase to about 2,500 RPM. That's not quite realistic. In the Roll 152, you should get a static power indication of about 2,400 RPM. And once you get airborne, then you get about 2,500 RPM. But in Flight Simulator, 2,300 is good for when you're not moving, 2,400 when you're rolling down the runway and not at high speed, and once you level off at cruise, 2,500 is full power. So check and make sure you're getting 2,300 to 2,400 RPM, and that indicates you're getting good takeoff power. As you're rolling down the runway, that's your takeoff roll. You want to maintain the runway center line with your rudder pedals or whatever you have that's controlling the yaw on Flight Simulator. It's very easy to overdo this on Flight Simulator, especially if you have like a twist type joystick that's doing your yaw axis. You want to make very small corrections. And again, I recommend having the auto rudder for takeoff enabled. It will cut down on the oscillations, especially if you have a very sensitive yaw axis on whatever your control is that you're using to control yaw. The goal here is, of course, to keep the nose wheel on the center line, but for standards, it's acceptable to have just the main gear straddling the center line. As long as the main gear, the center line, is between the main gear, it's acceptable if your nose gear is not exactly on the center line. 50 knots is our rotation speed, and the purpose of rotation is to smoothly rotate the nose up to the climb attitude, about 10 degrees pitch up, and then allow the airplane to fly itself off the runway. If you feel like you're pulling or yanking the airplane off the runway, you're not doing it correctly. You want to rotate the nose to that climb attitude, and then the airplane should come off the runway of its own accord. In the 152, that's going to happen pretty much as soon as you get to 10 degrees. Let's take a look at what that pitch attitude looks like. So there are two ways to set it. You can use your attitude indicator and put your little orange ball on the first big pip, which is marked as 10 degrees. But more preferable is to look out at the nose's orientation to the actual natural horizon outside. You'll notice that the nose cowling is just a little bit above the natural horizon out there. And that's where you want to set your pitch for rotation. It's just slightly above to where you can not quite see the horizon over the nose of the airplane, and you can see the horizon out the side, either side there. Some common mistakes that you see with rotation is under rotation or rotating too slow, or over rotation and or rotating too fast. Again, you want to take about a 2 or a 3 count to get from 0 degrees of pitch to 10 degrees of pitch. And if you rotate too slow or not enough, you'll notice when you come off the runway, you're going to be a little too fast. You'll probably be about 60 knots or a little more. That's a sign that you've under-rotated. You've either rotated too slow or you have not set your pitch quite high enough. If you're over-rotating, if you're rotating too fast, or you're pitching up too high on your initial climb, you're going to notice your speed's going to be a little low. It's going to be 55 knots or below, maybe getting even below 50 knots. That's a sign that you're over-rotating. Once you get airborne, just hold that pitch attitude and let the airplane accelerate through 60 knots. If the airplane's having a little trouble accelerating through 60 knots, then you probably have the nose up just a little high, so just release a little bit of back pressure on the stick, and it should come through 60 knots so you can put those flaps up. When you put the flaps up, you're going to experience just a little bit of a nose down tendency, so you want to keep a little bit of back pressure to prevent that from happening. And then just let the airplane to continue to accelerate to 70 knots. Once you've got 70 knots, then pitch to maintain that 70 knots. If it starts to accelerate past 70 knots, bring the nose up just a little bit. If it starts to decelerate, if it starts to slow down, then pitch your nose back down to regain that speed and get back to 70 knots. Should be about 10 degrees. You should be able to hold, a pretty constant pitch attitude and get a nice good 70 knot climb. Once you've got your pitch set that's maintaining that speed, use your elevator trim to trim so that you don't have to hold pressure on the stick. You see now if I let go of the controls, it wants to nose down, so I'm going to put some elevator up trim, nose up trim in there so that it just wants to hold that pitch and I don't have to maintain pressure on the controls. Still has a little more nose up trim to go. There we go. Now I let go of the controls a little more and it's going to maintain that pitch there for 70 knots. If you can learn to work that elevator trim, that reduces your workload quite a bit while flying the airplane. Once you get to 1,000 feet above the ground, above ground level AGL, you can turn your taxi and landing light off and accomplish your after takeoff checklist. Problem is, Flight Simulator doesn't give us an after takeoff checklist, neither does the 152 manual. And in fact, Flight Simulator doesn't give us any checklists after the takeoff procedure they have as a checklist, so we're going to have to make up our own. After takeoff checklist for this airplane, and again, this is something that you've already done these, just like in the before takeoff procedure, you do those first and then check them off, but we'll just keep it simple here. Check that you have turned the taxi and landing light off, and that you have the flaps up and 0 degrees, and then the after takeoff checklist is complete. All right, so let's go and fly this maneuver now. All right, so we're lined up on the runway 18 at Pine Bluff. We'll run through a quick before takeoff checklist. Our parking brake is released. Our lights and pitot heat are on. The trim is set, elevator trim is set for takeoff. Carb heat is off. Mixture's full rich. Flaps are 10. Transponder is alt. So we are ready for takeoff. Brakes are released. Go ahead and bring the full throttle up. Take about a 3 count to bring it all the way in there. Go ahead and toggle the yoke visibility so you can see that. Looking at the tachometer, comes up to about 2,300. It'll continue to accelerate. I'll make small corrections on the rudder here to keep it on the runway center line. Airspeed is alive. We're looking for 50 knots. There's 50 knots, so we'll rotate to that takeoff climb attitude. And then we'll hold that takeoff climb attitude and let the airplane accelerate. If it has trouble accelerating, just drop the nose just a little bit, just release a little bit of that back pressure. There's 60 knots, so we'll go ahead and retract the flaps to 0. You notice the nose wants to pitch down a little bit when you do that, so go ahead and put a little back pressure in there to keep it up there. And now we're at 70 knots, so we're going to use the pitch to maintain that 70 knots, and then we'll use the elevator trim to make the airplane stay at that 70 knot pitch, so we don't have to maintain constant back pressure to keep it there. So I've trimmed back, nose up just a little bit. And when I let go of the controls, that's where it wants to stay. Alright, so next thing we're looking for is 1,200 feet. That's where we'll do our after takeoff flow and our after takeoff checklist. We'll control the airspeed with the pitch at this point, and then we'll leave it at full power, and that'll dictate our climb rate. You can see we're doing about 700-800 feet a minute right now. And then if you get off your heading during the climb, just do just a little bit of bank in the direction to keep on that 1-0 heading. Just a couple degrees, just a little bit of a lean there. Alright, so there's 1,200 feet. We'll turn our lights off, and then we'll do after takeoff checklist. The lights are off, the flaps are at 0. The after takeoff checklist is complete. Now to go up and do our maneuvers, we're going to hold this heading about 180 degrees and climb at about 70 knots. We're going to climb up to 3,500 feet. Okay, so how do we know when we are proficient at doing normal takeoffs? Well, we'll list some proficiency standards for each maneuver so that you know when you've got that maneuver down. For normal takeoff, you should be able to set the appropriate takeoff power. I would worry about you a little bit if you can't do this. Maintain runway center line during your takeoff roll. And again, you don't have to have the nose wheel exactly on the center line, but you should at least have the main gear straddling the runway center line. Rotate consistently at 50 knots. Configure your aircraft once you're accelerating through 60 knots, once you're airborne. And then maintain a climb speed of 70 knots, plus 10, minus 5 knots. And maintain your heading in the departure climb, plus or minus 10 degrees. All right, let's talk about leveling off and doing straight and level flight. All right, to level off on the 152, I'm going to maintain full power and maintain that 70 knots until we are about 10% of our rate of climb away from the altitude that we want to level off at. We're going to level off at 3,500 feet. We're doing about 700 feet a minute up. 10% of 700 feet is 70 feet. So just when we cross through about 3,400 feet, just about one little tick mark past that is when we want to start to pitch over to level off. And what we want to do to level off is we're going to use our pitch. We're going to pitch down gently to about 0 degrees or nose level, and then we'll allow the airplane to accelerate while we keep full power in there. And then once we get to about 95 knots, we go ahead and pull the throttle back to 2,300 RPM on the tachometer, and then we trim the airplane out so that once to fly that nose level pitch, hands off. Alright, so we're crossing through 3,400 feet. There's about 80 feet, so we'll start a gentle pitch down. Slowly level that rate of climb off. You can see as we do that, the airplane starts to accelerate. It's going to take more forward pressure as the airplane continues to accelerate. We'll start trimming down so it maintains that level pitch and we don't have to keep pressure on there. You can see it's accelerating pretty well right now, coming up through about 90 knots. And there's 95 knots. See, we're about 2,500 RPM. I want to pull it about 2 tick marks back from that and get it to about 2,300 RPM. All right, so we're now pretty much in level flight. Still trimming just a little bit here. And we're doing about 95 knots. And if we want to make a fine-tune correction, we can just do that with pitch now on the altitude. So I'll pitch down just a little bit to get it back down to 3,500 feet. Then I'll pitch up and I'll trim it to maintain that 3,500 feet. Try to get that VSI at 0 there. All right, and as you can see, we've got about 2,300 RPM, 3,500 feet, 180 heading, and we are level. You can consider yourself proficient at straight and level flight when you can maintain your altitude plus or minus 100 feet, maintain your heading plus or minus 10 degrees, and maintain your airspeed plus or minus 10 knots. One more point on level flight, and that's if you get off your heading by a little bit, if you drift off that heading, all you want to do is use about a 5-degree bank, and that's about halfway between the 0-degree indicator and that first tick mark, which is 10 degrees. 5 to 10 degrees of bank will give you a nice little slow roll back towards your heading. Once you're about on the heading, go ahead and roll to wings level and that should get you back on your heading. So use just a little small banks when you're in straight and level flight to keep your heading centered up where you want it. Alright, so let's talk about level turns. 2 points I want to make before we start doing some practice on level turns. And that's, first of all, you'll notice people sometimes wonder, if you've never flown an airplane before, do you have to hold the control pressure in to keep the airplane banked? And the answer is no. You'll notice if I bank over here, once I bring the controls back to neutral, it keeps the bank in there. Okay, it doesn't keep rolling, and it doesn't roll back towards the middle. And then if I want to roll back level, I bring the controls back over that way, and once I neutralize the control, the roll stops again. When you get past about 30 degrees of bank, the airplane does have what we call an overbanking tendency, which means it tends to, instead of stay in the same place, it tends to continue the bank, and that's a tendency we'll learn about and deal with a little more when we get to the next lesson on steep turns. But for now, just realize that once you stop the control input, that roll stops. The other thing I want to point out is that in Flight Simulator, you do get just a little bit of adverse yaw. You'll notice that ball, when I make a roll, goes out just a little bit, but it's not bad. So I advocate for doing no rudder turns in Flight Simulator. You can try to use rudder in your turns, but for the most part, especially if you have a twist type rudder input, that's probably going to cause more problems than it's going to solve. So here is a bank without rudder, excuse me. And it does a decent turn. The ball's outside to the right just a little bit, but it's not bad. And it's pretty controllable. Whereas if I do the same thing and try to do rudder, you notice the ball bounces around a little bit more. And if I take that rudder out, it kind of swings around, the nose swings. It has a lot of oscillations to it. So I recommend in Flight Simulator, use zero rudder. Don't use any rudder for normal turns. Use that mostly for steering on the ground, and we'll want to use it a little bit in crosswind landings. Okay, so let's do a couple of practice turns here. A couple things to think about when you're doing your turns. First of all, you want to use about 20 degrees of bank for a normal turn in a 152. You can use up to 30 degrees of bank, but 20 degrees gives you a standard rate turn, which is good for when you get into instrument work to be making turns like that. It's a nice, comfortable turn in terms of your rated turn. And like I said, you can go up to 30 degrees, but you don't want to go beyond 30 degrees. Going beyond 30 degrees gets you into that area where the aircraft tends to overbank, like we were talking about earlier, and it also gets you into an area where you start to load up G-forces on the airplane as you make your turn. And it's also a point in a real airplane where if you had passengers, they start to get a little uncomfortable when they go beyond 30 degrees of bank. They don't like the wings tipping quite that much. So 20 degrees is good, up to 30 degrees is okay. The second thing is that you'll notice when you go into your bank, you're going to have the nose drop just a little bit, so you're going to want to apply a little bit of back pressure. What's happening there is some of the lift that usually goes straight up is tilting off to the side to help you around the turn, and when you lose that vertical lift, the nose tends to drop just a little bit. So just apply a little bit of back pressure in the turn. Usually it's not a good idea to trim just for turns, and then once you roll out, you will get all your vertical lift back, and the trim that you had set for level flight will still be a good trim setting. The final thing is that you want to lead your rollout. In other words, you want to start reducing your angle of a bank before you get to your actual heading. You want to lead it by about half of your angle of bank. So if you're doing a 20 degree bank, you want to lead it by about 10 degrees. And if you're doing 30 degrees of bank, you want to lead it by about 15 degrees. So for turning left from 180 to a heading of 090, for using 20 degrees of bank, we want to start that rollout at about 100, about 100 degrees of heading. All right, let's try a 90 degree turn to the left. Let's do it at 20 degrees of bank. So I'll roll gently into about a 20 degree bank, and then neutralize the controls. Use just a little bit of pitch, very small corrections in pitch, keep myself at my altitude. And then 10 degrees prior, we'll do a nice gentle roll back out to level. And there we are at about 090 degrees. I'll do just a little bit bank to the right to correct it back to the 090 degrees. All right, let's try a turn to the right. We'll do this one at 30 degrees. Let's let you see what the rate of turn looks like on a 30-degree bank turn. So roll back into about 30 degrees. A little too much back pressure there. And we'll lead the roll out by about 15 degrees. There we go. And that's level turns in a 152. For proficiency standards, you can consider yourself proficient when you can maintain your altitude in the turn plus or minus 100 feet, roll out on your heading plus or minus 10 degrees, and maintain your airspeed plus or minus 10 knots. So we've rolled back out to a heading of 090 degrees, and now we'll talk about doing a normal climb. To transition between level flight and normal climb in a 152, you want to smoothly bring your throttle back into full power, full throttle, and then smoothly pitch up to 10 degrees, just like you pitched for your initial takeoff climb. As you pitch for 10 degrees, your airspeed will start to bleed off, and as you get to 70 knots, then you're going to use the pitch to maintain that 70 knots and maintain full power. You want to go ahead and trim for that 70 knots, especially if you're going to be climbing for a while, which in a 152 you most likely will be. And the level off is going to be just like our initial level off. Once you get within about 10 degrees of your rate of climb to your level off altitude, then you'll want to start to gently pitch over for 0 degrees of pitch or nose level, and you're going to want to trim nose down as you're doing that to not have to maintain forward pressure on the controls. And as the airplane accelerates, you're going to have to continue to trim down. So allow the airplane to accelerate again at full power, just like we did earlier. And then once you reach that 95 knots, go ahead and pull the power back to about 2,300 RPM. Okay, so we're at 3,500 feet, heading to 090. Let's go ahead and climb to 5,500 feet. So I'm going to increase the power, and I'm going to pitch up to about 10 degrees. Airspeed's going to start to bleed off. I'm going to have to apply more back pressure as that happens, and to prevent myself from having to hold that back pressure in there, I'll go ahead and trim it. There's 70 knots. I don't want to get too slow, so I'll let the nose come down just a little bit, and then I'm going to trim it so that it will maintain that pitch for 70 knots for me. You see we're doing, again, about 600 or 700 feet per minute in our climb there. Alright, so we're coming through about 4,300 or 5,300 feet now. We want to level at 5,500. Doing about 600 feet a minute, so we want to lead the level off by about 60 feet. So about 2 tick marks past 5,400 feet is where I want to start my level off. It's right about there. We'll let the nose come down. We'll trim it down as we need to, so we don't have to continuously maintain forward pressure now. The airplane's going to accelerate, although it's not quite as enthusiastic up here in this thin air at 5,500 feet as it was down at 3,500 feet. And we'll continue to trim it down so we don't have to hold forward pressure on the stick. We're coming through 90 knots now. Get to 9,500 knots, or 95 knots, that would be impressive. And we'll pull it back to about 2,300 RPMs, and we'll trim it out for level flight. So that is a normal climb in a 152. And your standards for this are just like straight and level flight. You want to be able to maintain your altitude when you level off at plus or minus 100 feet. You want to be able to maintain your heading plus or minus 10 degrees, and then you want to be able to maintain your speed once you level off plus or minus about 10 knots. Alright, so now that we've done level turns and a normal climb, let's combine those two and do a climbing turn. Climbing turn is going to be the exact same as a level turn and a normal climb, except that our pitch is going to be just a little bit lower. You're using some of your vertical lift is being shunted off to the side to help you around the turn. So if you pitch up as high as you do in a normal climb, you're going to be a little slow on the airspeed. So we'll have that pitch just a little bit lower. We'll do the maneuver. We'll enter the climb first and then enter the turn. So here we go. We're going to put in full power and we're going to pitch for 70 knots. Again, probably just shy of 10 degrees of pitch, and you can go ahead and trim for that climb as well. And then we'll just do a 180-degree turn. Just do it at 20 degrees of bank. We're slowly getting down to our climb speed, and just like the normal turn, you want to lead your roll out by about 10 degrees. So there's 70 knots, and you can see the pitch is just a little bit less than what we would normally do. Just a little under 10 degrees. So we'll lead the rollout by about half the angle of bank. And then as you roll out there, keep that pitch up. You have to pitch up a little bit more actually. Keep that 70 knots, and we'll level off at 4,500 feet. Level off is just like a normal level off. You want to pitch, gain airspeed, and then reduce the power and trim for that normal flight. Lead it by about the same amount as you would in a normal climb. Reduce the power and trim. So that's another maneuver to practice, is your turning climbs. So our final maneuver for this lesson will be the descent. To perform a normal descent in the 152, first you want to apply carb heat, assuming you are electing to use carb heat, and then you want to reduce power. Initially, you're going to reduce power at about 2,000 RPM. That should give us about a 500 foot per minute descent. Then you're going to pitch to maintain the desired airspeed. Most of the airspeeds in the most of the descents in the 152 you're going to conduct at 95 knots unless you're actually on a landing approach. But most of the time you descend at cruise airspeed. Once you get into the descent, you're going to use your power to increase or decrease your descent rate. Generally 2,000 RPMs is going to give you about 500 feet per minute. If you'd like to come down a little faster, pull the power a little more. If you want to come down a little slower, then you can pull the power a little less. But 500 feet per minute is generally a pretty good descent rate. Then you're going to use your pitch to control the airspeed. And again, about 95 knots is where you want to keep it. When you pull the power on the initial entry into the maneuver, the nose is going to want to come down, so just allow it to fall down. And generally you're not going to need to trim it that much. It should, as you reduce power, it should maintain that pitch on its own. But if you find that it's wandering off the airspeed a little bit, pitch it for your desired airspeed and then trim it so it stays at that desired airspeed. Just like a descent, we're going to lead the level off by about 10% of the vertical speed. So if you're doing a 500 foot per minute descent, then you want to lead the level off by about 50 feet. Once you get to that lead off altitude, you're actually going to level off with power. And just like entering the descent, usually power is enough to bring the nose up. So you'll smoothly increase the power back up to 2,300 RPM. You'll allow the nose to pitch back up for level flight, and then you'll trim to maintain that pitch for level flight. Well, you'll pitch for the level flight and you'll trim to maintain that pitch, and then maintain 2,300 RPM. All right, let's do a demonstration. Okay, so I'm level at 5,500 feet, heading southbound, heading 180. And so we're going to do a descent at 180 degrees of heading at 500 feet a minute. So I'll pull the carb heat out. That drops the RPMs just a little bit. And then I will pull the RPMs back to about 2,000 RPMs and let the nose drop on down. It's going to maintain 95 knots, and I want to pitch to maintain 95 knots. I'll adjust that power a little bit. Actually, it's speeding up a little bit, so I need to pitch up just a little bit. And we'll maintain that 95 knots with our pitch. Alright, so you can see that gives us a nice about 500 foot per minute descent at 95 knots. If I want to increase the rate of descent, all I have to do is pull the power back just a little bit more. Let's pull it back to idle and see how fast it goes down. So if I pull the power back to idle, you notice in the air that's going to be a little bit under 1500 RPMs. That gives about a 1500 foot per minute descent rate. So it comes down pretty quick, even without the flaps. Actually about 1500 feet a minute. If I want to slow down the descent rate, I can bring that power back in. So we control the airspeed with our pitch, and we control the descent rate with our power. All right, coming through about 3,700 feet, we're going to level at 35, and again we want to lead the descent by about 50 feet. We're doing 500 feet a minute, so 10% is about 50 feet, and we're going to level off with power. So halfway between the 6 and the 5 is 50 feet, so I'll go ahead and start bringing that power back in. Getting back in the green arc, so I'll push the carb heat back in. Nose is going to come up of its own accord. And then I'm going to maintain that pitch to give myself level flight. And I'm going to trim to maintain that pitch. Wander off my heading a little bit there. So I'll use a small angle of bank to correct the heading. And now we're level, 3,500 feet, 180 degrees of heading. Proficiency standards for normal descents are pretty much the same as the rest of the maneuvers we've been doing today. In the descent, you should be able to maintain your heading plus or minus 10 degrees. You should be able to level at your desired altitude plus or minus 100 feet and maintain your airspeed both in the descent and the level off plus or minus 10 knots. You'll also want to practice descending turns. The only difference in a descending turn is that as you make that turn, the nose is going to want to drop just a little bit, which is going to increase your descent rate a little bit. So you may need to bump up the power a little bit to maintain your desired rate of descent. You'll still control the airspeed with your pitch and the descent rate with your power. All right, so that finishes up lesson number 1. I encourage you to go out and practice those basic maneuvers until you can pretty much fly them to proficiency standards. In the next couple of lessons, we'll be doing performance maneuvers to get you more comfortable with handling the 150 throughout its flight envelope. We'll start off with steep turns. Appreciate you joining us today. Hope you enjoyed the lesson, and we'll see you next time.